So, well, it's fantastic to have Professor Valletti here. I'm honored that he agreed to be our first keynote speaker here, and I'm especially privileged to have him in the room because I know he's taking some time away from some glorious days as the evening and as the sun sets on the Greek island where he's at somewhere, and I know there's a bottle of wine probably close by for him and his partner. So I know this is some high quality time in which he has just put in a decoy to try to deflect attention from what he's really doing and looking forward to. Anyway, enough of the me trying to be humorous here, and let me just say I'm so pleased to have Professor Valletti here with us. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to him and how I have come to know of him and know his work and to appreciate his work and to try to incorporate some of it into my own thinking. So Professor Valletti, kind of the official bio reads that he's currently the head of the Department of Economics and Public Policy at Imperial College Business School in London, and he's also the former chief competition economist of the European Commission, and I think that past tells us a lot about the man that we have here in front of us today. I love nothing more than an economist who's kind of has his come home to mother moment, where they come out of the sausage factory of public policy with new insights, new wisdom, new experience, and a new sense of things are not A-okay, and we need to change the course of the ship. We need to rethink some fundamental precepts of what the role of the economist, of the scholar, and of the participant in policy practices. And I really love this story about him. From what I know about his work, he's been active when he was the chief economist, competition economist at the European Commission in a number of mobile wireless and communication sector cases, as well as some of the emerging and recent cases around, Google and Apple and Facebook and so on. These entities that now, all of them, the communications companies and the digital internet giants, straddle the crossroads of commerce, communication, and culture. And, when you have somebody like Professor Valletti, who's had that kind of in the trenches experiences and decide to kind of leave those trenches and to rethink what the dismal science, economics, is actually doing, I think this is a really brave thing to do. It's a laudable thing to do, and we need more of it. And it reminds us of the pressing need for the kinds of things that we strive to do as part of this project, which is to create independent and imaginative research that basically takes on the intersection between markets, technology, policy, knowledge, and power. All right, so my hat's off to people who do that, and to our guest note speaker today. Kind of an anecdote, I think, helps to convey a little bit of what I've come to know about Professor Valletti, and I think it speaks volumes about who he is. When he left the European Commission, a consultancy approached him dangling lucrative offers of employment from here on out. Well, Professor Valletti said, no, thank you. And then they said, never, easy to give up on a prize like this. They offered him more money, and to which he again said, no. Only then did he realize that he's not an economist after all. In my books, we have heard similar stories like this, and we call people like this political economists, those who recognize that economics cannot be lifted above the fray to channel some pristine truth or empirical reality to which we must all bow down. That is not the way knowledge works. Okay, and so we see this with Professor Valletti. A couple more comments here. There's a series of co-authored papers and single-authored papers that Professor Valletti has put out that have drawn my attention and been incorporated into my work. Then, one of the key things that I'm seeing here is a rejection of the do-nothing, sit on your hands everything's okay approach. And second, and getting more down into the weeds, a rejection of the idea that we can try to change this behavior and operations or conduct of large businesses through regulatory means. I think the message that I'm getting from Professor Valletti's works is those are destined to fail, and instead we need to go back to the big guns in the regulator's toolkit, structural remedies to endemic market problems, endemic and enduring market problems. We have examples galore of this. I spoke earlier today of the 600 acquisitions undertaken by Apple, Facebook, and Google between 1998 and 2020 that were just basically waved through. No, maybe an eyebrow raised, but no concrete action taken. And we look where, kind of one of the more recent hurrahs for the behavioral or conduct-based remedy in the United States when the Trump administration blessed the takeover of Sprint by T-Mobile, and this kind of elaborate set of mechanisms were put into place that were essentially supposed to try to replace the now disappearing Sprint company as a rival with a new rival that these behavioral mechanisms would help to bring about over the period of 7 years, and it was known as Dish. Well, it's been an abject failure, and it teaches us better bird in hand than the one or two in the bush. All right. We saw the same thing here in Canada. In 2017, we saw Bell take over MTS, a legacy telecom operator in the province of Manitoba that had cut an independent path for over a century and really showed us that things could be different. All right, but Bell acquired that company in 2017. The Competition Bureau waved it through with some behavioral-based remedies that were designed to basically hothouse a new replacement into being called ExploreNet Wireless. Well, ExploreNet Wireless closed its doors in the last couple of months. It's been a complete failure, and whatever claim Manitoba had to setting itself apart from the rest of the country by having this independent rival player is now just a receding part of our memory. So if you're going to regulate, go after the structure and deal with these things seriously. Do not try to use regulatory measures to get companies to do what's basically opposite of their interests and incentives. And basically, when a regulator doesn't have the knowledge or expertise that the company themselves have as they warehouse the knowledge. I think it's this realization that's finally coming home to roost or dawning on our Competition Bureau here in Canada, which, breaking ranks with past practice has now come out four square in opposition to the sixth largest Canadian acquisition in history, if it goes through, between Rogers, the second largest communications and media conglomerate in Canada, and Shaw, the fourth largest communications and media conglomerate in Canada. The Competition Bureau, completely breaking ranks with past practice, is just saying no, as I think they should. That's what I have to say. So I think we can see the kind of influence that Professor Valletti's thinking is having, on our own research. And I think it's, if he's not directly kind of whispering into the ears of the Competition Bureau staff here, I think indirectly the kind of things that Professor Valletti now talks about are starting to become, once again, part of the discourse around antitrust law and communications regulation. And so I welcome our guest here. Thank you very much, Tommaso. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dwayne. It's a real thanks a lot for this great introduction. By the way, anecdote about the consultants trying to hire me at the end of my policy job is true. So I may actually offer a quote, or better, a misquote from Marx, obviously Groucho Marx, by saying, I should have responded like, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I do not have others. So I think it's important also to have a set of principles, and the experience at the commission for me was quite revealing, because it kind of reawakened me also as a political animal, not just as a scholar closing the ivory tower. I think it was a great job, and it's been a fantastic experience I would wish everybody could have. So tonight I will share with you let me share the screen to start with. A couple of thoughts that I have. There you go. Hope you can see it, because I don't see myself. Yeah, I hope you can see. So I'm going to talk about two related topics about concentration in big tech and concentration in the communication sector. I'll probably spend more time on the former. By the way, if you have comments, especially if you're online, you can put it in the chat, or otherwise, if you're in the audience, there will be people with microphones. I'm going to speak for about 30, 40 minutes, and then I'm sure that there will be time for some interaction. So I'll start with big tech. As Dwayne said, I'm an academic economist. So I will present you the views of an economist. And incidentally, I am a very orthodox economist, but also somebody who's been in the trenches and who has seen things, not just in theory, but also in practice. When it comes to big tech, I have in mind, obviously, the internet, the commercial internet. Obviously, the internet starts a long time ago, but the commercial nature of the internet comes along about 30 years ago in the 90s. The way I see it, two very broad brushes, is that there are two distinct periods. So the first period is one of innovation, disruption. That these are on the slide young people in Silicon Valley in the early 90s, and some of the brand names we are well familiar with, the Google, the Amazon, they were coming along. And the internet was a fantastic thing. It was a fantastic thing, reducing search cost. The market impact would have been unprecedented, creating markets that didn't exist before, reducing search costs for us. Basically, there was the entire human knowledge that was available within a few clicks. You would start your journey, and the internet was a stepping stone into a much wider journey of knowledge and learning and information. So that's pretty amazing, I would think. So in a sense, the internet was also a promise of democracy, because thanks to that easy access of information, we could make our politicians accountable. And so this is more democracy. So that was incredible. And some of this, of course, has been delivered, but we have been less attentive to what happened in the second part of this period. So in about 2008, that's when concentration and dominance comes along, and people didn't see it coming. So this is just an example. This is a master thesis from a student at Imperial some years back. And what this slide, very simple slide, is showing, the student is a Dutch person. So what you see in the search bar, these strange words, autoverzekering, I'm very bad in my Dutch. It basically means car insurance in Dutch. It was Dutch. And so what changes over time, and it just maps about 10 years. So in 2010, if you were looking for a car insurance in the Netherlands, you would have a lot of blue links. So the blue links are basically what the algorithm is supposed to return, the best search for you. And there was a little bit on the top about paid links. By the way, these red bars have been superimposed by him, because Google has always been very careful in not making a very neat distinction between what's paid and what's unpaid. But what changes over time, as you can see, is that most of our attentions, most of the screen is being taken over by paid ads. So the nature of the internet changes from this organic searches that should give, in principle, the best result for you. Instead, the results are dictated by an auction process. Whoever is willing to pay the most to have access to your attention is going to be placed at the top. And this has continued, and is particularly true when it comes to cellular device, mobile phones, because the screen size is very limited. So one of the lessons I learned at the commission is that this idea that people can search, can do rational searches, can go on page 2, 3, 4, 5 of the search results is just not to be seen in the data. So people are very passive. There's lots of behavioral insights which are very, very relevant. And most likely you in the audience are not really representative of the market. You have to think of the average person. The average person, and this is what we saw in the Google shopping case, for instance, 99% of the searches stop on the first 3 results. That's it. And if you're demoted onto page 2 and 3, you are nowhere to be seen, and you're basically dead. So this is a change. So this idea that the internet could give you access to all this information that you look for, and instead you just need to grab the attention on the first page. This very limited attention and a lot of psychological element. Another related data point, which is important, is this notion that the internet was a stepping stone into human knowledge. You start your journey, and some of us do that, but again, we're not representative. Most of us, actually 2/3, according to this figure in front of you on the slide, are zero-click searchers. That is to say, when you're looking for something in the Google ecosystem, you stop, because Google already offers you perhaps what you want, so it's not necessarily bad. But again, this idea that you go somewhere else, that you use it, and you don't get out of the Google ecosystem. Actually, 2/3 of the searchers start in the Google and stop there, so you don't go anywhere else. And dominance has been going on for a long period. I mentioned 2008. These are figures from 2010, but you could go back in time. This is the market share of desktop shares worldwide, and it's in excess of 90%. European numbers are very similar, actually higher than that. And 95% of Google searches of searches, I like the mistake I made, are indeed only from a single search engine, which is Google. So 95% is, and it's not just 1 year and then things change. It's been like this for almost 15 years. That's an incredibly long period. So one of the ideas that we had to revise as economists, or at least some of us started revising, is that we started thinking about this dynamic market that can be a very quick reversal of fortune. There is this idea, this notion of competition for the market that can change everything. Well, I don't know what you think, but 15 years is a long enough time period to be seriously worried that competition for the market is nowhere to be seen. I don't want to single out only Google, so let me also mention Facebook. Let me put these figures in context. I'm sure you remember January 6th last year, the riots in the Capitol Hill. A very bad moment for democracy. On the same day, coincidentally or not coincidentally, I don't know, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, decided to change unilaterally the terms of service of WhatsApp. And this unilateral change basically meant less privacy. Despite the turmoil happening in Washington, the change did not go unnoticed. Lots of people started relating to that. And lots of people said, we have to do something. It's unacceptable that WhatsApp is using the tremendous market power they have. We have to look for alternatives. So let's download Signal, so our privacy will be preserved. Now, I'm sure that some of you did download Signal, but the point is not downloading an app. The point is about using the app. So in order to use the messaging services, you also need to convince, the way it is structured now, you also need to convince all your friends, all your contacts. You have to convince your grandmother, you convince your chat groups to do the same. And that's virtually impossible. So ask yourselves, even those of you which are very tech savvy, how many times have you actually used Signal on a big basis, on a daily basis, not just with a single person. So, and your communication is not going there. So now let me mention these figures, because people then said, you see, Signal has been downloaded. Again, the quick reversal of fortunes in this market. There is lots of dynamism going on. But these are the figures of actual usage. So you have to sum the number 1 and number 2, because Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp is basically owned by the same company. And you have to remove number 3 and number 4, because those are Chinese services, and China is a completely separate market. So if you see what's happening, China excluded, Signal is nowhere to be seen. So despite this big attention, and the same happened when there was a big outage last fall. For instance, people, again, they said we have to do something, an outage of the Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp ecosystem, but then people are stuck because of the network externalities which are endemic. Now, all this concentration and dominance is going on within a context which is much bigger than this. Of course, tonight we're going to talk only about big tech and telecoms companies. But I want to say that in the past 30 years, something has changed fundamentally in many markets, probably due to technological change, but also much more relaxed intervention by several authorities. So the picture on the left-hand side is saying that this is not a North American phenomenon, since you are in North America. It's also a European phenomenon. Perhaps in terms of level of concentration, Europe is a bit better, but the historical trend towards concentration of industries is there as well. So these are figures I collected when I was at the Commission, European Commission, and the red bar is basically industrial concentration. You can, no matter how you cut the data, you always have the same message. And the red bars is concentration 20 years ago in specific industries, finance, communication, electricity, whatever, fishing, real estate, restaurants. And the blue bars is industrial concentration 20 years ago, and it's been going up considerably. The middle diagram is quite a well-known diagram from Economist. That's De Leuker, Eckhout, and Unger. 2 years back, they are reporting the average markup in the economy. The markup is the ability of firms to sustain prices above variable cost. So the markup is really a notion of market power. It doesn't tell you whether it is good market power or bad market power, but still, it is market power. And again, this is saying that about 30, 35 years ago, something changed, and firms have been consistently able to exercise more market power. By the way, behind this figure, which is an average figure, there is a lot of heterogeneity, and all these upward results that you see in the picture are coming from the firms at the top, okay? From the Google, from the Monsanto, from the Bayer, from these kind of companies, because instead firms at the bottom, they don't exercise market power. So we have this historical tendency towards concentration in markets and towards excessive profits being made, and these profits are actually kept by the owners of the firms, and they don't trickle down to the workers. Because the downside of this picture is that, also a well-known phenomenon, over the same period, there is an historical decrease of the share of wealth that we create every year. That's the GDP, the gross domestic product, and the share that goes to the workers has been going down historically. Again, you have exception among the individual superstar jobs, but on average, wages are going down as a share of GDP. So back to big tech, people typically jump up and they say, well, you cannot mix, Apple and pears, you cannot mix Apple and Google. These are different business models. You have to be mindful. True, they're different things, but actually there is more similarity that you may think of when you start looking at the economic problem. So two business models, two companies are identical in terms of business model. That's Google and Facebook. They give you something for free, and then they profile you and they sell targeted advertising to companies. So this is the paid ads business model. But Google also has other problems, of course, because Google is also integrated across the value chain. It offers search, but also comparison shopping services, also, maps, a lot of other things, and they can favor themselves against the other companies. And this favoring themselves is what actually is the linkage between Google and Amazon. Amazon, in principle, is a different business model. It's a marketplace, but it's both a referee. They're setting the rules for the digital market, but also a player. Elizabeth Warren saying you cannot be both an umpire and a player. And that's similar to the Google self-preferencing problem. By the way, the Amazon share of advertising of online advertising is also going up. So it's not so different from paid ads of Google and Facebook. And then there is Apple and Microsoft, which are selling stuff. Apple is selling very nice devices we love and they're very expensive. But Apple is similar to Google and Amazon in terms of self-preferencing. So Apple obviously has a monopoly over the Apple Store, and so you have to go through the Apple Store and you pay, if you're successful, an Apple tax of 30%. But sometimes, typical example, which is in front of the courts now, is Spotify. Sometimes Apple has also a service which is competing against some of these apps. So Apple has Apple Music, and they're competing against Spotify, but Apple is not imputing itself the 30% Apple tax, which instead has to be paid by Spotify. So, and this is similar to Google and Amazon when they're self-preferencing, they're giving a preferential treatment to their own products. And Microsoft, interestingly, despite being a super dominant company, if you think it is probably the most dominant product in the world in the digital space now, is probably in Word. No, everybody's using Word, at least in our organizations. But Microsoft managed to fly under the radar in the past 25 years, possibly because it was basically the last antitrust case that the US ever ran. It was actually settled out of court. There was a settlement, but that was during Clinton. We're talking really a long time ago. And then for the remaining quarter of a century, the United States basically abdicated on any antitrust enforcement. Generally, they haven't done much, but specifically in the digital space. And I wouldn't be particularly concerned about the initial period when the Google were emerging, when the Amazon were emerging, because it was a dynamic market. I am instead concerned 2008 and onward. So it wasn't only under Trump that we had a problem. The big problem with big tech started with President Obama, in fact. So the big problem of under-enforcement, it started with President Obama, and by no surprise, the big tech companies were the big financial supporters of the Obama campaign. In Europe, we did more. We started running cases. As Dwayne said, I ran 3 Google cases, 1 Apple, 1 Amazon, 1 Facebook, plus other stuff in the digital space. There has been a very heated discussion, so people which are not in the antitrust bubble should keep in mind that there are thousands and thousands of pages of evidence coming from the cases. So it's just there. They're not written in a way that they're not published in academic terms. And these are proceedings from hearings, from courts, but there is a lot. So it's just about digging there and you'll find a lot. It's in Europe, it's in Australia, it's in South Korea, it's all over. And recently, there's a change of leadership in the US, obviously, also among the antitrust enforcers. And so a lot of stuff is happening in the US. As you probably know, there are a lot of laws which are stuck now that needs to be voted, and we will see whether they go anywhere or not. But the debate among practitioners was, okay, this big success of the big tech was coming from their own merit. So ultimately, Google is a good search engine. Facebook connects lots of people. Amazon delivers stuff very quickly. Sure, there is a lot of that, but there is also something else. So with dominance came also the abuse of dominance. If Google is so good and so efficient, why, when a mobile phone manufacturer needs to install Android, which is owned by Google, why do they need to accept some contractual agreement that everything pre-installed on the phone will be owned by Google? So the Play Store, the search engine, and so forth. Okay? Similarly, if Google is so good, why do they need to pay $15 billion to Apple every year to be pre-installed also as preferred search engine, also on iOS, which is the only alternative operating system for cellular devices? So these contractual arrangements that would be okay if they were done by firms without market power are not okay when it comes to firms with market power. This growth came through abuse of dominance. This growth came also through mergers. Actually, Dwayne, my numbers are in excess of yours. In the last 20 years, there have been in excess of 1,000 mergers, including GAFAM. So I don't know which companies you included, but Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft have bought in excess of 1,000 companies. And zero has been blocked. More worryingly, 97% of those mergers have not been vetted by anyone globally. So you see them. There are technical reasons for that, but politically, nobody really wanted to go there. As you can see, I've changed in red 1001 to 1, because finally, a few months back, the CMA, which is the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, which is a country where I currently live, finally blocked the acquisition of Giphy by Facebook. They call themselves Meta now. And so now it's 1001 to 1, but as I often say, it's a small consolation to score a goal when you're down 1000 to 0. But that's where we are now. So this growth came also because of severe under enforcement. These are big numbers. We cannot just dismiss them. These are very large numbers. In Europe, we tried. We tried with good cases, but with a lot of problems, which I will mention. We tried to impose fines. To commoners like us, these fines look big. Cumulatively, the fines that the European Commission gave, coincidentally, under my tenure there, we gave 3 fines to Google that add up to $10 billion. Well, that's a lot of money. But think about the revenues of Google, the business model of Google. From advertising alone, they are making about $250 to $300 billion a year, every year. So you can see that's a cost of doing business. No? So if you, and these are one-off. They got this 3 fines or something that they've done for so many years. So they are not really biting a lot. Most importantly, antitrust enforcement has been a complete failure when it comes to the speed of enforcement. Again, there are legal reasons that you want to have a due process, the right of defense, but when you are against you, companies which are worth trillions of dollars in market capitalization, they bring the best lawyers, they slow down the process. And Google Shopping, which was the first in the triad, took 7 years to complete for various reasons, but even Google Android, which was seen as the best case of the 3 cases that we ran at DG.com, took only 2.5 years. And in these markets, by the end of the case, when companies are dead, you cannot go back in time. So antitrust has failed. Has failed also because antitrust, that's not in the mindset of the antitrust enforcers. They never want to tell you, they tell you you did something wrong, but you don't tell you how to change your behavior. They never want to go in the nitty-gritty of what you should be doing because they fear of being outsmarted by the companies, but they are always outsmarted by the companies. So Google Shopping that finished in 2017, still now the Commission hasn't accepted formally the remedies that have been imposed because they're basically not working, and that's a big concern. But this has been important to change our way of reflecting over these markets. As Dwayne said, we need to do something more. So at least we learned, and I want to say very explicitly, that antitrust enforcement, behavioral enforcement doesn't work with these companies. It doesn't, simply. It does not, and we have to recognize it. It is something that we have to tell also to people in different countries, because the same debate is happening, I don't know, in South America, in Brazil, in Africa, in very big countries, and still they're saying, well, maybe we should use antitrust, we should do this and that. It should be simply. And lobbies, another thing which I witnessed personally. Of course, I did anticipate lobbying efforts in Brussels or in Washington, D.C., but I didn't anticipate how pervasive that was. And if you're interested, I can give you examples. But pervasive is not just corruption. I don't think, for instance, any official in the European Commission was corrupt, but there was an environment where every day there was a workshop, a meeting, an evening seminar, a cocktail, debating these issues, where there were the lawyers of the big companies, a few academic shills that would be there without disclosing what they were doing. And ultimately, even well-intentioned enforcers would listen always to a narrative that markets work, which everything is fine, don't be worried. And so they thought there was no problem whatsoever. And by the way, in general, markets are fine, but here we're not talking about the average market. We are talking about the most concentrated markets on earth, and the markets we depend in very subtle way from. So what can we do? And I will split into between what can we do from a policy perspective and what can we do as academics. So what can policymakers do? Here's a slide with some solutions that are being discussed now. One is finally having realized that antitrust doesn't work. Actually, we have a set of tools coming from a regulatory tradition that, with ups and downs, with various degree of success, has worked. Think of telecoms. So, as I said, I am based in the UK. There are currently 4 major mobile network operators, and if it's an oligopoly, perhaps a cozy oligopoly, but if I'm not very happy with one of them, I can kind of easily switch. And why can I switch? Well, because I can speak to anyone else. Okay, there is interoperability, there is interconnection, there is something called mobile number portability. I'm not going to lose my number. I can port it. I can keep all my contacts. So that makes my life easy. And then we leave it to the market to try to deliver solutions. But that's very different from the problem I started from with a Signal. So imagine how different it would be if you, through Signal, could be immediately interconnected to WhatsApp, for instance. That would make the life of Signal or any other entrant much easier. So this is a set of ex-ante rules that we're finally introducing in Europe for something called the DMA, the Digital Markets Act. And that's a good thing. So if you think about it, it's an easy concept. There are externalities, we know. There are good externalities, and when the externalities are good, we want them to benefit everybody in the industry, not just one player, because otherwise there is monopolization. And so the good externalities are going to be common to everybody through interconnection, interoperability, data portability, with one big caveat that we didn't have in telecoms: privacy, because privacy was not a big issue in the early days of telecommunication. Instead, it's a huge issue nowadays. So you have to make sure that you build a good system and it's not a race to the bottom, where information becomes a far west. So there are very good tools which are in front of us, and we have experience that we have applied in other industries with network effects, big investment, etc. The difference, though, compared to those traditional industries, is that those were largely national industry within the boundaries of a single country. Still, I mean, a mobile operator, cellular operator has to be within Canada, within the UK. And instead, these are global companies. So there is really a problem of getting together several regulators, otherwise we're not going to find a solution. And so they can still play one regulator against the other, divide and conquer type of strategies done by the lobbyist. The thing in green, rebuttable structure presumption, is, I think, something which is very pragmatic, that the lawyers see as anathema. I think could be, from my perspective, really a good change. Until now, if you think how cases were run, the burden of proof was on the regulator. The regulator had to do a very lengthy market definition that would be contested by the parties, wasting a lot of resources really to prove that Facebook is dominant or Google is dominant. I don't think that that's very productive. Instead, we should go back in time, and I say it as a very orthodox industrial economist, to a structural presumption. So when firms are above a certain size, there is no perfect metric. Every metric will be imperfect. But when you are above 50% of a quickly defined market, or where you have a certain, the value of a transaction is particularly high, you can find some numbers, as imperfect as they may be. There is no perfect number. And then you say, you guys, why do you need to merge with yet another firm? You have all the resources to make rather than buy. Why do you need to buy someone else? So I will presume that this further increase in concentration is bad, unless, and this is the rebuttable part, I throw the ball back into your camp, and you have to prove me with a high threshold, and that's I'm changing the burden of proof there. You have to prove me that you really need that purchase, that behavior, and no alternative is available to you to do something which is going to be good ultimately for consumers. And that's the rebuttable part. And that would change the discussion massively, because resources will not be wasted on useless market definition, and the resources instead will be invested into really double checking. Most of the job would be done, of course, by the consultants and the army of lawyers that they have, but still, they have to produce some cogent information that can show that it's only through that deal that consumers will be better off. And I think that would be a massive practical change in the competition sphere. And then what about academics? Ultimately, this is an academic conference, and we are we want to get there. So here I have a big statement, and I want to elaborate on this, otherwise it just becomes a populistic headline. But my view is that economics, when it comes to big tech, has failed. It's been a failure, not a success. And why? So let me elaborate on this now. It's been a failure because if I think of what we were doing as economists 25 years ago, that's what, when these platforms were coming along, we were calling two-sided markets, multi-sided platforms, and so forth. We put together a framework, a good one, that was saying these platforms are indeed amazing because they can create markets that wouldn't otherwise exist, because there are efficiencies, there are externalities. That's a good thing. However, precisely because of these externalities, there is a tendency towards monopolization. So there is a trade-off, efficiencies versus monopolization. This is something we knew 25 years ago. That's a quarter of a century ago. I even wrote some of those papers applied to telecoms. Now, if I'm thinking of the debate we're having now in the US, in Canada, in Europe, you name it, on the regulation of these companies, what do we say? Well, there is a trade-off. Sure, there is monopolization, but there is also efficiencies. And if I have to listen to that, I say, but that's what we said 25 years ago. So we haven't made any advancement. And in that sense, it's been a failure because intellectually, we haven't learned anything else. And why we haven't learned anything else? There's a fundamental problem because if there is a trade-off, the trade-off you have to solve it with some data. And that's a problem. We haven't done any empirical work on big tech for 25 years. And why? For something that I call the Uber problem and the big tech problem. The Uber problem doesn't apply to the big tech we're talking about, but there is some research which has been done using data from some digital platforms. Uber is one of them. Airbnb is another one. eBay, to some extent, is another one. So there is some research that economists have been doing, but this research is predetermined. So Uber will give you data, and they gave data to University of Chicago professors, to very important people, only if you do a research in a certain predetermined line that puts Uber in a good perspective. A very famous example is a paper which has been published in a top journal in economics, where there was an allegation that male drivers of Uber were paid more than female drivers. So there was a gender discrimination type of allegation. So a data set was given to economists, and economists said, look, there is a pay differential, but if you look at the data in a careful way, you will see that male drivers typically drive faster. And because they drive faster, they can have more rides, and so they get more money. So there is not a discrimination because they are getting paid the same per ride, but just male drivers driving faster. Now, if you are an economist, you immediately understand that this may drive into a problem. If you drive faster, you may cause more accidents. That's, I believe that's pretty simple to understand. So if you really want to do a piece of research to look at this question, you should have looked also whether this created a more hazard, more accident risks. The world didn't allow to look into that question. So the Uber problem is of companies which allow you to do research on their stuff only if you look at the positive things they generate. They will never allow you to do any research if it puts them under a negative light. And then there is more fundamental, the big tech problem. The big tech problem is the following. When it comes to the GAFAM I mentioned, and Google, Facebook, Amazon in particular, when it comes to competition, I want to be very precise, because that's what we've been talking about for the past half hour. They never gave access to any independent researcher to do academic work in the past 25 years. So this has dramatic consequences for academics, because in economics, now the golden standard is to do empirical work. If you don't have data, basically you don't publish. And if you don't publish, you're dead. So that meant that generations of economists did something else. They saw there was no possibility to have any meaningful research on GAFAM-related competition problems, and so they moved on to, I don't know, developed economics, experimental economics, finance, you name it. But generation of scholars didn't ask questions. So questions have not been asked, and we haven't, and that's why we haven't learned anything. So not because economics is bad as such, but because we couldn't do anything. But I also want to say that there is some hope. One hope is that, for instance, in Europe, we have something called I mentioned the DMA before, the Digital Markets Act. There's also the DSA, the Digital Services Act. And part of the DSA imposes firms which are designated as gatekeepers, so the GAFAM for sure, to share with academics data on a regular basis. And that's great. So fine, but this is coming by a regulation. These are not charities. You shouldn't expect them to give you data because they are nice. Okay? Otherwise, you might have just the Uber problem. But it's by a regulation. It's by regulation. In telecoms, we can do research because regulators collect information. We can do research on airlines because regulators collect information. We can do research on pharmaceutical companies because regulators collect information. So finally, we are there. With a long delay, but finally we are there. And it's important that the academic community is ready to accept this data, making sure that the interfaces for the data exchanges, the data are collected in a meaningful way. Otherwise, it is a waste of, it's a wasted opportunity. I want to mention interdisciplinarity, but not because I want to pay lip service to interdisciplinarity as such, and I know you are a communication expert, but because in big tech, really, you need to have communication experts, data scientists, privacy experts, economists, legal experts. I mean, you need all those people together. An example is on the slide, is about privacy and competition. When I started in Brussels as an enforcer, I was being told basically that the line to take was, anytime you talk about privacy, you have to say, oh, we care a lot about privacy. It's a very important thing for us. However, it's not our job. It's the job of consumer protection. And we are doing competition. Privacy has nothing to do with competition. And this is wrong. And this is wrong because how can you talk about competition if you don't understand the business model? A business model which is built around data collection. And so privacy is there. It's at the very core. So this is something we've learned. And we have to help the enforcers to go there. And incidentally, so the silos approach has to stop. We also have to stop talking about the privacy paradox out of context. Again, this is something coming from academics. They have learned, study privacy, good stuff, and they saw that people sometimes give away information for a slice of pizza. But the type of questions that have produced the privacy paradox, you probably know, is basically that people in theory care a lot about privacy, but then in practice do very little, or they give away, indeed, lots of information for a slice of pizza. But this is not meaningful for the type of privacy question we are being asked in a digital context. Because we are under pressure, we are doing a search, we have to send a message, and we have to accept terms of service which are completely meaningless. They are written in a way where basically saying, if you want, take it or leave it. Take it or leave it, which is a manifestation of market power. And we may use your data, and we may share your data with third parties that we approve. What does that mean? It's meaningless, isn't it? Instead, if you were asking, if the question was framed in a different way, well, do you want to accept the terms of service, which mean that the data may be shared with a financial institution that may deny access to a loan or a mortgage to you 2 years down the line because you're being provided in a certain way? You probably would react in a different way. And these are cases which indeed have happened. So framing is. As economists, we have to open ourselves. Currently, I don't know, there is a whole generation of economists that always want to see the unintended consequences of things. So now GDPR was adopted in Europe a few years ago. That's good for economists because it gives you some data variation before and after, and there's a bunch of papers coming out. The bunch of papers coming out are focused exclusively on the potential cost of GDPR. And I don't even know if it is a cost. They basically see whether the introduction of GDPR has reduced the number of apps in Europe before and after using some control groups. I don't even know if this is bad. Maybe it was a long tail of very predatory apps that didn't need to exist. We have no idea. But no one does research on the benefits. So GDPR was introduced in order to give more privacy, and nobody does research whether people were happier or less happy on the privacy policy. So we need to direct our efforts in things that we think are meaningful and also help us. So for instance, when I talk to privacy experts from the legal side, they say, but you economists are obsessed with quantification of things, and privacy is a fundamental right, which is something that sounds right to me. It sounds correct, but I want to be helped. And then what? And then from a policy perspective, can I not make trade-offs around it? Can I understand what that means? So help me understand as an economist what a fundamental right is. Otherwise, we are people talking different languages, and we never understand each other. So we really need to talk and change vantage point. These are two examples I want to go quickly now from some research of mine, in case you're interested. So very, as I said, within the orthodoxy, if you're ready to change vantage point, you can still do something useful. So a question here I had, a merger between two big tech, take Google, I don't know, Instagram and Facebook, a real one which has happened. The way regulators looked at it was where Instagram was defined as a market for online camera apps. That was a functional market definition, very narrow market, online camera apps. Facebook is a social network. There is no overlap. These are zero price markets. We see no problem for consumers. So consumer cannot be worse off through this merger. Now, with Andrea Pratt, we said in a recent paper in AJ Micro this year, we are saying, forget about Google being a search engine, Facebook being a social network. These are attention brokers. The business model is basically collecting information about us in real time and sending us targeted information also in real time, which makes the business model very different from traditional media that cannot do that. And this is obviously a theoretical approach. It's a theory paper because once again, we don't have the data to bring to an empirical test because they're not made available to us. But we're developing a framework where we show that once you interpret this digital platform as attention brokers, further concentration into this market will lead to targeted ads of a certain kind that lead themselves to monopolization into product markets. So behind the ads, there will be products. So to make it simple, a merger between Google and Facebook may still be a zero price market. However, will create a tendency to monopolization in the market for pizza delivery, for local dentists, etc., and we explain how this happens. So consumer in the end lose because they pay more for products. Okay? So you can still have a standard neoclassical approach, but change in the vantage point. So forget about that functional definition and start thinking about this platform in a different way. This is another question I'm currently researching on, going really back at the beginning of the antitrust movement in the US 100 years ago. The antitrust movement was concerned with size and power because of monopolization, of course, because of high prices, but also because profits being made by larger corporations would interfere with the democratic process. So the curse of bigness is a curse to democracy, in a sense. What can we do about it? Recent paper I've just completed, still with Andrea and also Bo Cowgill at Columbia University, Political Power and Market Power. We have collected data of all the mergers in the US over the past 20 years. So there is merging parties before and after, and we can link what these companies are doing in terms of activities of influence towards the politicians. So we have all the lobbying data they have, all the donation to PACs, and what we find, the challenge for an economist is to find it and to show it's a causal relationship. But you should read the paper to see whether we are convincing or not. But we do say that a merger which increases the size of a company leads to further lobbying by those companies to affect the kind of regulations which are favorable to them. So for instance, you may lobby a regulator to keep foreigners out, foreign companies out, or in favor of or your own standard and against the potential competitors and so forth. So monopoly begets monopoly, and the consumer loses twice from a merger. In a traditional way, because prices go up, but also in the political economy way, because this merged company will do more efforts to influence the regulators and the politicians in their own favor. To give just a quantification, we find that this in the US economy leads to at least $2 billion. This merger activity leads to at least extra $2 billion of lobbying every year. So it's a permanent influence. I will now spend 7 minutes on telecoms consolidation. Consolidation, again, I want to say, I've been studying telecoms for 25 years, and I've seen this coming every single time. There is this allegation that there is a famous trade-off. Consolidation drives prices up, but it's needed to have more investment. And it's always needed because there is a new technological change. 2G versus first G, digital versus analog, 4G versus 3G. Now it's 5G versus 4G. Now it's different. We really need to invest more. We need consolidation. Is there any evidence? So I wrote a paper some years ago that probably now I would rewrite in a slightly different way. But what we find, this is comparing different countries, different mergers, different. So it's the best you can do with cross-country comparison. So it's a cross-country comparison type of study. And we do find that unambiguously, anytime two firms merge, prices go up. It's unambiguous, no matter what specification in the model you do. And the average effect is 15%. So the average merger in mobile increases prices by 50%, and that's a lot. What about investment? We have limited information, we do the best we can with the data, but we basically find that yes, the remaining firms invest a bit more. We cannot tell you in what, but they invest a bit more. However, you remove also a competitor. So at the country level, nothing changed. So basically, you have a merge that increases prices for sure and doesn't change the overall investment. So where is the trade-off? Where is the trade-off? There is no trade-off. I've written something more vocal recently, which brings together extra literature which has been done, because mergers are being proposed. We heard about Canada, but also in the UK, Three and Vodafone. Spain has a merger which has been proposed very recently. Germany may be the next. Italy has one that may arise. South America, there are also attempts there. So it's coming back. It's coming back, and we have to resist this quite strongly, in my opinion. The last two data points are on these slides, where I'm comparing the US. These are the red lines. You see AT&T, Verizon, Comcast, T-Mobile, and European cellular operators, the blue line. So what this slide is showing, there is no analysis here. These are Bloomberg data, some raw data about infrastructure investment, CAPEX, that you can find easily. So on average, and quite evidently, European companies invest more on infrastructure, right? The blue lines are above the red lines. Look at the next slide. The next slide, you have profitability of firms on the horizontal axis and potential for growth on the vertical axis. So first, it is saying that obviously Facebook, Google, they are a different league, very profitable, huge growth, etc., etc. But what's interesting? There are two things which are interesting. Before investment, US companies and European companies are fairly similar in terms of profitability level and growth. Okay, the size is different, of course, but they're not massively different. If anything, since you're communication guys, a problem is here. Traditional media companies, they are really struggling. That's a different thing. Okay? But the European and American companies before investment are not that different. They do become different, though, once you take into account the infrastructure. The US companies are here, and the European companies are here. Okay? But why? Because they invest more. And why? Because there's more competition. So structurally, European markets are less concentrated than the US market. So the story is it's quite simple. The overall profitability. So basically, if you are competing, you cannot keep the money for yourself. You have to compete either by reducing prices or by making better investment to retain your customers. So it's exactly the opposite of those which are calling for further consolidation in the mobile industry. And these are data. So try to rebut this data if people want to be against me, of course. I would always be happy to have a conversation about it. But since I understand that it's a hot topic in Canada these days, it's great to hear that there is, the mind of people are more open to accept these arguments, which are well-founded in economics and in the data, which is. That brings me to an end, and I thank you so much. And if there's any question on what's happening next, I'm here with you. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tommaso, for that stimulating and kind of nice personal odyssey account of where you've come from in the last 25 years and how that maps on to the political economy of communication, big tech, and the media. Now, I'm flying by the seat of my pants a little bit here because I can't see questions coming in from the Zoom session, but I can see questions from here. And so, are there questions from the floor? Anybody want to engage? Yes. So please come up, grab a microphone over here, and tee up your question. Give us a brief introduction to yourself, and let's try to keep them questions, okay? Small commentary, and then over to Tommaso.
Hello, Professor Valletti. Thank you so much for a great talk. My name is Pavan Manhas. I work for the Senate of Canada. I'm curious, you mentioned a couple of things about zero-click searchers and interoperability on the internet, and that's something that's particularly interesting in the case of Google, as Google right now has just entered into an agreement with Wikipedia, but for a number of years it was sort of skimming data off of Wikipedia, using it on its search bar so that it would induce zero-click searchers, and that was something that Wikipedia was fairly opposed to, as you can imagine. It was taking away views and things like that. I'm curious, and then the same thing with Google and AMP, where sometimes if you're on a phone using Google Chrome, you click on a news article, instead of going to the New York Times webpage, it'll give you a simplified version of the New York Times article on AMP, AMP, and that might take away some advertisement revenue for the New York Times or whomever. To that basic idea, I'm curious of your thoughts about interoperability as something which is being taken advantage of by for-profit corporations against non-profit corporations like archive.org or Wikipedia or the Wikimedia Foundation, things of that nature, and where that fits in with the idea of interoperability as like a commune system versus a for-profit system that is being taken advantage of in some cases. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So shall we collect a few questions first and then I answer?
Sure. Is there anything from so Guy's helping me out here. He's got questions from the Zoom.
Yeah, we've got one question here from Michael Lee Murphy. The Competition Bureau is currently advocating an overhaul of several elements of Canadian competition law. What does Professor Valletti think of the continued presence of the efficiencies defence in Canadian competition law?
Sure.
One more question before you bundle them together.
Hello, hi, Afra Kerr. I'm based in Ireland. I just really asking for you some reflections from your time in the European Commission. This would with regard to the GDPR. It would appear that there's a real problem, or has been, with enforcement, as you mentioned. But some of the most interesting pressures seem to have been coming from legal activism. So cases taken by civil society groups or people like Max Schrems, and more recently by Johnny Ryan from the Irish Council of Civil Liberties. I wonder, could you speak to that kinds of pressures in terms of the policy-making process? Thank you.
Thanks.
I can already see two more questions, one from Ellie and one from Vas, but I'm already getting confused, and if nothing else, we want to save me from getting confused.
I can answer these first three very quickly, yeah?
Yeah.
Great. So the interoperability is a great thing. So this is something that we learned from the early days of the internet. That's a fundamental thing that to be preserved. Then there is a notion of fairness, of how to share, who does what. I'm not answering directly your question because I know less about Wikipedia, but there is a great experience coming from down under, from Australia, from the ACCC. The ACCC introduced a bargaining code between Facebook, Google, and the traditional media industry, and not because Murdoch is there, to be honest. And it's not that the regulator wants to determine the terms of the negotiations between these parties, but basically saying we are here as a backstop, as an arbitrator, and they do something which is, I think it's called the baseball last offer, something like this. So this is some sport analogy. I know nothing about baseball. I'm a European, but the idea is that the regulator, if they simply asked Google how much do you want to pay the Guardian for access to the news, or Wikipedia, and Wikipedia and Google, how much do you want to be paid? Obviously, they would blow up or just shrink figures which are completely unrealistic. And instead, this is saying, you should negotiate. I'm not here to regulate. But if you don't manage to find a commercial agreement on the terms of sharing media snippet or whatever it is, I'm going to ask you, how much do you want, Google? How much are you willing to pay to the Guardian? And then I will choose one and only one. I'm not doing any average. I'll choose only one offer. Only one offer, which I think, as an arbitrator, is the most reasonable one. So this will induce. And what's happened since the introduction of the bargaining code about a year ago? So this is an interesting data point for researchers to see before and after, is that especially when it comes to Google, they managed to negotiate very good and swift deals without any need of regulatory intervention, just under the shadow of a possible intervention. They managed to obtain deals which were hundreds of millions of dollars going to the media industry, which is, I think, very healthy for investigative journalism. So these are good solutions that other countries should be looking into. There was a question about efficiency. Efficiency is something that I'm not against efficiency, so having an efficiency defense will stay in the law, even in my rebuttable presumption, if you understood it, if something is so efficient and you really need that merger to reach that efficiency, prove it to me. I have to say, though, that how skeptical I am of efficiencies in the sense that these are already the largest companies. Or, let me rephrase it, a lot of efficiencies for small firms that want to grow bigger, by all means, they're there, they should be there. But when you are already the largest company in the world, how much bigger do you need to become to be even more efficient? No? So if size was driving all the efficiencies, then the Soviet Union would have won, right? So all the production would be somewhere in some former Soviet country only doing steel, and this hasn't worked. So I'm very skeptical that there are many efficiencies that are still to be earned. But if companies can prove in a cogent way, which is, for instance, merger specific, that you cannot do through any other contractual arrangement, etc., then by all means, I think enforcers should be open to that. Then GDPR. Since the person asking the question is Irish, as you know, the European enforcement of GDPR in Europe is in Ireland, and it's been a disaster. Probably because in Ireland, lots of these companies are incorporated, so the Irish government did strike a good deal with them, especially for taxation reasons. You mentioned civil society. When it comes to GDPR, my view is that it's a great law in principle. It has not been enforced. There's something called purpose limitation. So the law says that data can be collected only for a strict purpose, which has to be told to us in a very evident way and cannot be used in any other way unless we are being told. And this has never been enforced. So it's been a bit of a scam. So my fear when it comes to DMA, the regulation of big tech, is that there may be another Brussels effect where the laws are great in theory, but they are not enforced. The good thing that you mentioned, Johnny Ryan and others, civil society did play a big role. This has been, and I would see this as a positive note. So during my tenure in Brussels, everything was dictated. Actually, the gatekeepers there are not the consultant economists, they're the lawyers. It's a big law firm. So the consultancies, the economic consultancies are begging for the favor of the big law firms. This because they are the gatekeepers in the business and they make multiple millions on every case. But when I was there, all the discussion was dictated by them. Recently, though, I see more and more civil society having access to some of the proceedings. They can make comments. And when there was, I don't know, the Google Fitbit case, there were privacy experts that were consulted. The merger was approved, which I think was a bad decision. But I do see there is a greater demand coming from, you said the right word is a civil society indeed. And that's exactly what we need when it comes to the communication sectors. We need to discuss. We need to put together all these different views about how do we imagine our digital future. No, it's only through. We may have different opinions, but we have to hear those different opinions. If we keep hearing always one narrative, which is unilateral, we're not going to go anywhere, and that's not very helpful.
Okay, so I'm going to do another thing that's my prerogative since I, am the leader of this thing, which is we're going to stick around till 3 o'clock, basically, is what I'm saying. So I'm changing the agenda. We've got two questions right now, and I know both of the speakers, and we got two more online. So we're going to tee up first with Ellie there, if you don't mind, and then we're going to go to Vas, all right, and then we're going to go to online, and yeah. So.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great talk. And I agree with much, but not with everything, which is just on a factual level. I think you mentioned something about the US for 25 years has not kind of gone after these companies. And in some ways, I've heard this perspective more or less. It's part of a bit of a Brussels narrative, which is we are that thin line between monopoly and we kind of have these values. But is it factually correct? Well, first of all, of course, the aggressive enforcement is mostly against American companies. I will just say this parenthetically, much less so against European ones. But is it true that in the US this has not taken place? I could just think just at the top of my head, there was the challenge against AT&T's merger with Warner Media. It was a challenge of AT&T attempt to merge with Sprint.
T-Mobile, I think.
There was the challenge. There was the challenge of Time Warner. Of Time Warner Cable with Comcast. These were all giant mergers. There was a challenge against the merger of two large publishers, Penguin and Simon & Schuster. It's just kind of like at the top of my head. Now, not all of these challenges, and this is important, so maybe you kind of phrased it just correctly so that your facts are right. Not all of these were formal law proceedings. They were more like in the informal way of saying, if you go forward with this merger, we will challenge you, and therefore the merger goes away. But certainly in the case of AT&T with Warner Cable, there was an actually formal challenge, etc. So I don't think that this notion somehow US does nothing, but Brussels is there to help you, society, is not quite correct.
So you want to
Sure, I'm very happy to respond to Ellie, so thanks a lot. First, it's true. I mean, these are the biggest companies in the world, are American, and so you look at where the problem is, and if they happen to be American, you should be looking at those companies. By the same token, you don't know all the cases we do against the European companies. So, for instance, the biggest case during my tenure was a prohibition of a merger between Alstom and Siemens on high-speed trains. That was after Brexit. so that the top German company, the top French company wanted to merge together in high-speed trains where there was number one and number two companies in the world, and we blocked it. And there was political willingness to accept it. There was a French president calling, there was a German chancellor calling, and then and we blocked it. Okay? And we blocked it. Obviously, you didn't hear anything about it in the US because you don't care about Armstrong and Siemens. But that was actually the most difficult case that I ran during my 3 years. And then we imposed lots of fines for cartels on German car manufacturers. We impose fines on truck cartels among European car manufacturers. So you don't hear about that. In fact, Anu Bradford, which is a scholar in the US, has done an analysis of all the decisions of the EU on mergers, because antitrust there is so little. And she found that once you condition for, market size, probability of dominance, etc., the fact that a company is European or American, etc., has no bearing on whether or not the case goes on. I think there is no point to say that Europe is against America or America is against Europe. These are technocrats which are doing their job, and I think it's on antitrust enforcement in the US. I will reiterate that when it comes to big tech, you mentioned cellular mergers, publishers, which are recent one, by the way. But when it comes to big tech, nothing has been done for 25 years, and my talk is about big tech. So my point stays there. And there is also, if you read, some anti-monopolists such as Matt Stoller, etc., they would tell you that in the past 25 years, the DOJ used to bring a certain number of cases, 200, 250 challenges every year. They went down historically down to 70, 80. So there is an historical decline. You can read which is in Gallup, so it's not zero. It's zero, of course, but it's something that we're trying to change. We're trying to change. So we are already supportive of what the US is doing now, both at Cantor and in Cannes. It's something that we are looking forward to seeing what they can do.
All right, Vas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Tommaso, for your presentation. Dwayne, I was worried when you said you were invoking your like rights and privileges that you were going to cut off questions. I wonder if we could spend a couple of minutes and maybe go back to the paper you mentioned, Tommaso, that you did with a couple of colleagues that used US data and found that over the past 20 years, after a merger, lobbying expenditure increased by about 30%. And I think it's relevant for us to be thinking about in a Canadian context, because somebody else brought up a question around our efficiency defense and sort of just signaling that we're rethinking or interrogating competition in Canada. And in your presentation, you raised great questions for policymakers. What can policymakers do? Where have academics or economists perhaps failed us a little bit or had some blind spots? And we've taken some serious shots at consultants who may be tuning in or trying to learn and certainly have a role here, but maybe we've underappreciated the revolving door between some of these roles. And in Canada, we could never replicate the research that you've done because we lack comparable lobbying expenditure analysis. So that is, obviously why I'm asking you the question, but I thought it helped us understand a lot about how things change or maybe why they don't.
So there are a few things there. So first is, and by the way, I've already failed by my own standards. You should always ask an academic to disclose if there is any conflict of interest. There's nothing wrong with doing consulting work, but it has to be, in front of the light. And I should say, I don't do any consulting work. I sometimes only help with the CMA on the UK regulator on stuff unrelated to big tech. So, but you should always ask. So I think disclosure is not yet there, especially when it comes to all these meetings, all these conferences with the lawyers, etc. You must ask up front. The problem of the consultants is, and it's a problem of academics also when it comes to economics. The consultants have somehow digested the economics in a way which is favorable to big corporations, even distorting what economics actually tells. And so every vertical merger is efficient, which has no finding in the economic literature because there is a trade-off between double marginalization and foreclosure. So, but you have something like this, which you don't know where they're coming from, but you have centers of lobbyists, academic think tanks, which are called the Global Antitrust Institute or the Center for Law and Economics, whatever it's called. There is a few places in the US that are constantly present to go in front of the DOJ, FTC. On every case, they produce a pamphlet with the kind of simple economics digested in 5 pages to give an idea that everything is fine, don't worry, approve, and don't intervene because markets will fix everything. And the problem is that these are not academics, and the academics we are in our ivory towers doing our papers subject to our publication guidelines that we have to follow, and we don't know what
Whoa.
because we don't have time to talk to you. This is happening, so we need to put together some goodwill. And this is a nice period, but we need also some resources. So we need also to find somebody who's willing to fund some scholarships, something in order for us also to have some free time to think about the policy implications of our research. As another example, and then I know we are over time, but for instance, when I was mentioning all the behavioral issues when it comes to big tech, that we never go on page 2, that they default on our phones, we never change, etc. I was speaking to a colleague who's a psychologist, and they were saying, but we've been knowing this for 20 years. What's a novelty? We knew about all these behavioral biases. But then we were starting talking, and it became apparent. There was also an interesting question for this person. And this person said, you knew it, but how come that your findings were never known to the policymakers? Is it because of these revolving doors, psychologists don't get access to policymakers, or is it because you don't care? Is it because also you publish in outlets using a jargon which is not actionable? So, and he started thinking, this other person, and it's a bit of both. So we need also to roll up our sleeves if we're interested and get our research written in a way which is actionable and understood by the enforcers.
Okay, so you ask. Okay, so one more director's privilege, and please, give me, your charity, your generosity. But hey, look, I love this. We have Professor Valletti here. We've got great people in the room, great people online. So what I'm saying is, final offer is like 3:15, and we're done. And then that just pushes the whole schedule back a half hour. All right. So we get our 2 questions online. We get our question from Conrad. And then we probably wrap it up. Well, but it will not go past 3:15. Okay? Indulge me.
We have Dwayne's word on that. Okay, so I've got 2 questions here. One from Sean Ibbott. What role would barriers to entry have on market concentration in the past 30 years? Have barriers to entry increased in that time span along with market concentration? Industries such as aviation, which have large barriers to entry, tend to be more concentrated, and I'm curious to know if that also has had an effect on increasing market concentration in the past 30 years. And second question from Greg Taylor, is there a template to follow for requiring data availability from big tech via regulation? In Canada, this situation is getting worse in the annual reports of the media regulator. Professor Winseck has been nobly filling in these gaps for years.
Good thing I extended the time, eh?
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the efficiency defense. I think you did, as you know, the efficiency defense calls for trade-off and tells the enforcer, and I used to be the Commissioner of Competition, so I've been in that position, you have to trade off anti-competitive effects against efficiencies. Obviously, that's difficult because they have quite different beasts that you're trading off. But the whole idea is if the merger creates efficiency for the economy as a whole, you have to allow it, even if it causes certain anti-competitive effects. And you're basically trading off consumer rights versus sort of future benefits and efficiencies. So my personal opinion is a completely unworkable concept, a misplaced idea. It comes from the days when Canada was a small country and you thought you had to create economic giants in order to compete abroad. But I'd be interested in your view, whether you think this is A, workable, and whether it should be sustained or not. Thank you.
But thanks again. So there was a question about barriers to entry. Yes, barriers to entry have increased over time. If you are interested, in a sense, this is the research that John Sutton has been doing in industrial organization. It is a book, Technology and Market Structure. So the largest companies can spend more, and they can spend more and they become bigger. But then for a new company to come in, they cannot match the same expenditure. And so there is both very concentrated oligopolistic market structure with extra profits. And despite that, they cannot attract further entry because it is unfeasible for these companies to match the existing expenditure. What's worrying in this perspective, if you look at, again, broad brush evidence, it's about industrial dynamism. People have been looking at the turnover of firms in the economy, and because firms are created every year and firms die every year, and historically we had, and the economy is healthy, say, if more firms born compared to those which die, and there is a net growth. Historically, we see instead that the rate of exit is more or less constant. So people die now, firms die now as they died in the past. And instead, the rate of entry has declined dramatically. And it's now even below the rate of exit. So there is a net exit overall, including this. And that's worrying. And that's worrying. And what's perhaps not known by many people, that's also true when it comes to Silicon Valley. People think that, this is still growing amazingly, etc., etc. It's not true any longer. It's not true any longer. There is also a net decline in the rate of venture firms, also in big tech. So yes, the barriers to entry have increased. These are at the root of the concentration that we are seeing now. And when you have extreme monopolization, you have to intervene via regulation. We know that, right? Because we saw that antitrust is part of it. On data regulation, I don't remember exactly the question, but I will give you just examples of what our societies can do. And I think a good example and a bad example. And I talk about health data. It's nothing to do with communication, but that's a very important one. So health data are really a crucial battle is being fought there right now when it comes to health data for financial products, insurance, and so forth. So there is a model which is what the UK has done. And the UK has decided to do something extremely bad. There is a great company called DeepMind, awesome company, they do incredible stuff, but DeepMind was allowed to get all data from some NHS trust, that's the National Health Service, not knowing exactly what kind of deal that was. They got data about 2 million individual patients, both primary care and secondary care data that no one could have access to. I am at Imperial College, it is a big medical school. I spoke to my medical colleagues and said, but could you obtain that kind of data for research purposes? And they said, no way, even if I could be winning the Nobel Prize, I couldn't because of breach of privacy. Instead, that data was given to DeepMind, which was bought by Google, and all that information has been integrated with Android, and we have no idea where those data went. There is an app which is now being sent to doctors and NHS, and then you reiterate this leadership that Google will have, because no one else can use the same data, no one else can match, and they're already 3 steps ahead of anyone else in that kind of game, and we have lost our privacy, and we didn't even get a good deal because there was not even an auction process. You said, okay, let's give the data out to the best bidder. Not even that. So that's a terrible model. So I hope Canada is not getting there like you were trying to do with Toronto Sidewalk. You stopped it, and that was good. Okay, that was good. Don't do that. And then there is the Danish case. So in Denmark, when it comes to health Health data are collected by a data regulator, with very good skills, technical skills. Everybody can train the algorithm on a pool of data that the regulator has put together. Everybody makes a request. You just pay whatever cost it takes to assemble the data set for you. Data are anonymized according to the protocols that the industry and academia has decided are the right ones to follow. So according to the protocols that all the scientists would typically follow. And you don't give any competitive advantage. You keep your algorithm. If you, Google, have the best algorithm, it's yours, okay? But anybody can train the data over the same pool of data if they make a reasonable request to the regulator. To me, I don't know, in Europe maybe we are more inclined towards regulation, but when it comes to these things, that's a better model that society has put together. And now when it comes to Canada, you can decide what is the model that you want to follow. And that's a fair question. On efficiency, again, so efficiency, I think I don't want to repeat what I said earlier. When it comes to efficiency for large firms, to have cogent proof that this efficiency exists, it's tough. It's a sort of loop there. So when it comes to my experience, so I don't have a general legal view about it. My view, though, is that there is a perception that regulators are not very keen on accepting efficiencies because they are very difficult to prove. And then the consultants make submissions which are very weak on efficiencies, and then therefore the regulator says there is nothing to be seen because these efficiencies don't exist. But you know that is true technologically, that's because the submission is weak. But I've never seen a compelling case in my work as a practitioner. I mentioned Armstrong Siemens, these high-speed trains, just to tell you how poor efficiency submissions were. The only efficiency submission that Armstrong and Siemens, German and French companies, put together was to bid for these contracts. High-speed trains are sold via procurement contracts. It's a costly process. It costs money to put together a bid in a tender. And therefore, if we merge, we will save on bidding costs. You say, what? I mean, that's a problem. No? If you merge, instead of competing against each other, you will compete less. So that was the efficiency defense that the consultants to the almighty Armstrong and Siemens. So that was a joke, and obviously it wasn't accepted. And so if these are the efficiencies that people have in mind, we should just ignore them.
Okay. So I'm just going to close with two comments. One is to say that the data focus in your talk today, Tommaso, I think is very appropriate and also very relevant here to Canada because, you know, basically data services are kind of a new vector of expansion for the major telecoms operators here. So last year, at the end of the last year, Bell, the biggest communications company, for example, took over Environics, the biggest data analytics company in the country. And TELUS over the last decade has been moving aggressively into health services and all the health information. Now I want to circle back by way of wrapping this up to my friend and colleague Greg Taylor's questions about, is there some kind of template for information disclosure that you have in the UK or the EC that we might use as a guide for here? Because we too are talking about an online streaming act, an online news act, which are, you know, have some overlaps with the DSA, the DMA, the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. And they do have this idea of, they have a requirement in them about information disclosure, but it's very, very fuzzy as to what that standard is going to be, and it's largely punted to the regulator. And as Greg knows, and as I know, and most people in this room who research in Canada know, it's becoming harder, not easier, to get information about regulated companies. So we're trying to tackle that problem. Any advice from you would be a great way to close out this, and then we'll take our break until 3:30, and we'll come back. Okay, so last crack, Dr. Valletti.
Thank you, Dwayne. I think my advice to you is keep asking questions, try to run cases, go to your representatives and see and try. try to run actual cases, because that's how we learn things. All these European regulations that we will have in place, we cannot have a perfect system in place, because if we wait for the perfect system, then it will be too late. What we don't want is the extra next 15 years of monopolization. And you can do that only by learning. So make sure that you have the right skills inside your enforcers, and do cases. And academics should be there, be present, be part of the conversation, be part of the conversation. So it's only learning by doing that will get us an answer to that. So I'm sorry I cannot give you any wise words on how to do it, but that's what we have done. Dwayne and I have been looking at telecoms for many years, and we learned a lot of stuff by doing things. And the same applies there. This is not fiction. It's the reality. But you need to have computer scientists. You need to have data experts. You need to have the lawyers, the economists, the communication experts. But you need also a breed of technical guys that are going to help us on understanding how these data are collected and used. Because otherwise, we're going to be behind. If regulators are still made by lawyers and economists, we're not going to go very far, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, these regulations, what was?
As I'm saying, if instead regulators keep being made only by lawyers and economists as until now, I don't think we're going to make a big progress, unfortunately. We are the generation that failed on taming the big tech, so we need the younger guys. Go to your university in the communication science and the computer science department and get some of those guys with you.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, again, Tommaso, a real pleasure to kind of meet you in animated form, if not in physical form. I hope the next time we actually get to, meet you face to face in real life, as they say. But really pleased to have had you here. Thank you, everybody, for indulging the flexible, the flexibility of time and so on. But I really think it was worth it. So let's take a break now. Come back for the final session today at 3:30. And then we'll take a short break after that, and then we're going to go join the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Projects after the day's event, social event, just down beside where we had lunch today. Okay? So again, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.